Okay, so now I have the honor of introducing someone who really needs no introduction. uh, Dennis Paulson, who will give us tonight's presentation. And Dennis has done so many things over so many years, I don't even know where to start. Uh, Elaine gave me a two-page memo of that I could read, but I'm not even sure I could read it. But suffices to say that Dennis actually originated in Florida, moved to Washington at a tender young age after getting his Ph.D. on insects from the University of Miami. He's also held position at all of those institutions there and continues to participate, I think, fairly frequently at the Slater Museum at the University of Puget Sound. Many of us know Dennis from his many years of running and teaching the Seattle Master Birder program. How many in this room have taken that program? Just almost half. That's amazing. Great. Anyway, from 1988 through its entire run, I think through 19, or was it 2019? Yeah. I'm still more easy with the 19s than the 20s. Anyway, so Dennis has also done a lot of private or I suppose countless lectures to various groups such as this, and symposia, scientific meetings. He's also an avid nature photographer. He tells me now that that's what really makes him tick, is getting the pictures. He wants to get the picture, and certainly a fabulous tour guide. Written a bunch of books, some of which are on the back table there, and published numerous scientific papers. So anyway, I think without further ado, I'd like to turn it over. I actually couldn't figure out what that was, other than the fact that, yeah, Dennis was one of the founders of WOS back in 1988, which coincidentally is when the Master Birder program started. So he really cranked it up a notch that year. So, all right. And what's with the alligator, or was that a crocodile?
Tell us about that, Dennis.
Okay, alligator.
This is called a pregnant pause. Oh, there it goes.
Come back in, I don't know, 5-10 years when there'll be an AI robot up here doing all this.
Oh, please,
Maybe
please.
even giving the talk too.
Bring one.
And they will have their microphone, of course, turned on because it's built into their mouth. Okay, thanks a lot, John. I hope I can live up to that just with cormorants. These aren't hummingbirds or shorebirds or raptors, which everybody loves. Who loves anybody love cormorants here? Oh, wow, that's pretty good. Okay. I guess I instilled that in some of the master birders. Okay, if I can remember how to work this then. Cormorants are pretty cool birds. I've always liked them. I've always loved photographing them. I didn't say here that I've seen 24 species of cormorants around the world and actually luckily enough, took photographs of all of them at one time or another. You can see they're large birds. They're foot-propelled surface divers. They swim along in the water. They dive down after their prey, which is mostly fish, but some invertebrates. Some species eat a lot of shrimp, or some of them even go to the bottom and pick up crabs and other things like that. They have a long neck and a hooked bill. We see that very plainly on them. A fairly long tail, which varies quite a bit in length in the different species. Toady palmate feet, which means feet that are all four toes are connected by webs, something that's relatively uncommon in the bird world. The adults are black, but some of them are black and white. The immatures are usually recognizably different, often browner. And they have a brief breeding plumage when they sometimes put on plumes on their head, or their various naked skin around their bill and throat change color. And that's often held for no more than a month or something like that until they're actually on their breeding colonies, and they very quickly get rid of that breeding plumage. Okay, so you didn't see any from the very beginning. I don't think, I better go back and just quick reiterate.
Okay.
This is where we
So
really
tiny.
started. You can see that now. Large birds, foot-propelled surface divers, mostly fish they eat, but some invertebrates. Long neck and hooked bill, long tail, most of them, which facilitates their flying. Long tail is a very good thing if you're flying into things like cliff ledges and dock pilings and places like that. You want a very good flight control, and that long tail helps a lot with that. Toady palmate feet, all the toes connected by webs. Adults black or black and white, immatures usually duller, browner, and a very brief breeding plumage, which you heard we talk about. 42 species worldwide, formerly in one genus, now split into 7, entirely based on DNA, but also their morphology and other aspects of their plumage, anatomy, in other words. We have 2 genera here, Euryale, the Pelagic, and Brandts, and Nanopterum, or double-crested. And several other parts of the world where there are more than one species of cormorant, they're often in several genera. And probably logically, because they're probably inhabiting somewhat different niches. One of them dives in shallower water, one of them feeds more on fish, sort of just differences such as that. Certainly size differences are pretty important in the whole group. The largest is a Great Cormorant. This one was at a nesting colony in Nova Scotia, 3,000 grams. That's quite a few pounds, 454 grams to a pound, to more than 6 pounds. Great Cormorant is the most widespread species of cormorant, very, very widespread in all across Eurasia, even in Australia, where it looks about the same. Oh, I'm sorry about that top thing is hiding some of the, oh man, that's gonna hide names. No. All my names start at the top.
No.
That will go away. Okay, that's better. I will say that as technology improves and improves and improves over the years and decades, it gets harder and harder to work with. And there are more glitches all the time. And this old guy is, yeah, I suppose, yeah. Uh-oh, what you just did, Elaine.
Yeah, you just click on your slide to make it go back.
Oh, that's okay now. Okay, so this is a small species, long-tailed cormorant in Namibia, very widespread in Africa, 545 grams, much smaller than that Great Cormorant. And our pelagic, which we think of as a fairly small cormorant, you see is about 3 times that size. So this is a pretty small critter, but it is not the smallest. The smallest is the Little Cormorant in India, 450 grams, about 1/4 the size of a pelagic cormorant. And very small bill. Cormorants aren't all black, as I said. Some of them have a lot of white underneath. The white-breasted cormorant occurring all across Africa as a close relative of the Great Cormorant, which doesn't occur in Africa. It's actually split from it. They were considered the same species for quite a while. The Guanay cormorant, characteristic of the Humboldt Current off Peru and Chile, is one of the most abundant cormorants in the world, nests by the thousands and thousands on offshore islands, and produces such a thick stack of poop that the guano, as it's called, was actually collected when the ships first started going around the oceans to bring things from continent to continent. One of the real prizes was the guano on the islands and the Peruvian and Chilean coasts, which were actually taken by ships from all around the coast of South America and brought back to Europe as fertilizer. So it was one of the big things that was taken away from its native country, stealing all that poop from these cormorants. And just like sugar and coffee and tea and things like that were commodities. The black-faced cormorant just lives in cold waters of southern Australia. Antarctic shags, there are cormorants right down to Antarctica. The species is quite abundant on quite a few of the Antarctic islands and some mainland areas. Very, very black and white, like many seabirds are. The rock shag, a small species of southern South America, including the Falkland Islands. That's probably many of you know, that's a Magellanic oyster catcher in the background. The little pied cormorant in Australia, probably the whitest of all of them, and another very small species. And you can get black ones and black and white ones together, as here, the little pied and the little black cormorant in Australia. Both quite common in fresh water. Some are a bit more colorful yet. Red-legged cormorant is another species of the Humboldt Current, the west coast of South America, Peru down to Chile. And this species, while the guaneless cormorant nests on top of the islands in huge, huge colonies, the red-legged live on cliffs along the sides of the colonies of the islands in much smaller numbers. They have beautiful eyes. We all have looked closely at double-crested cormorants in here and seen their very beautiful green eyes. The little black cormorant, you may not be able to see this so well. Little black cormorant with its turquoise eyes. And the Brandt's cormorant right here in Washington with blue eyes. And those colors are pretty common on cormorants throughout the world. Some of them have brown eyes, but they're pretty fancy with bright blue eye rings, like the Antarctic shags. Shag is another name for cormorant, and that name has been used back and forth. Some species have been called both cormorant and shag over time, but that name is now restricted to a small number of southern species, Southern Ocean species. Oh, no, that's not true. There's one in Europe as well. That's a shag in Europe. Crowned cormorants in the Benguela Current in Southern Africa, sort of the equivalent of the Humboldt Current in South America, a cold, very productive current that comes up from Antarctica, has large populations of cormorants as well. The crowned cormorant has red eyes. We have 3 species in Washington, as I'm sure all of you know. Double-crested is the largest one, with bright orange throat and facial skin, sometimes looking yellow from a distance. A blue throat, blue inside the mouth in breeding condition. You don't see that very often, but when they open their mouth wide, just for a certain short time in the spring, you get to see that. The immatures are much paler with pale breasts and dark bellies. Probably the immatures of this are as different from the adults as in any of them. We have Brandt's cormorants here. See some of the names are at the bottom too. Brandt's cormorants here, almost the size of the double-crested with a more slender, dark bill and none of that bright color around the face. They do have a little buffy patch on each side of the bill under the eyes. The immatures are brown as the one to the left. They've got a short tail, probably the shortest tail of any one of the shortest tails of anywhere in the world, of cormorants anywhere in the world, and certainly the shortest tail of our 3 species. And they're not particularly good flyers. They don't land on ledges. They don't land in trees. They do land on the tops of pilings, though. And the 3rd species, the pelagic, much smaller than the other 2, with a very slender little bill, pencil-sized bill with a very small hook at the end that you can barely see. Very shiny black plumage. Here's double-crested and Brandt's together. Double-crested with that heavier, pale bill and the bright color around the face. Very different in habits. A double-crested cormorant tends to feed on bottom fish around the shore. The Brandt's out in open water on midwater schooling fish. Double-crested and pelagic, often roosting together. The pelagic much, much smaller and no bright color around the face except for a short time of the breeding season. Brandt's and pelagic together coming into breeding color. The Brandt's probably 1.5 to 1 2/3 time the size of the pelagic with a relatively shorter tail. They often are together. You can see these differences. Brandt's and on the left and pelagic perching together. The Brandt's has a kind of a fluffy crown, so it often has looks like it's got a more rounded head than the other 2 cormorants. Pelagic has a very slender, sleek head. All of them perch on pilings. This is a bunch of Brandt's cormorants perched above a pelagic. The pelagic, being a smaller species, is usually relegated to lower down on the pilings or wherever they're perching. Also probably a little more agile than the Brandt, so it can land on the side while the Brandt's are sitting on the top. Double-crested perching with pelagic very often. Again, the pelagics tend to be lower, much, much smaller. Here are all 3 species together, something you can often see at the Keystone Ferry Landing on Whidbey Island. The double-crested with the bright throats, the Brandt's sitting next to a double-crested with just a little buffy patch on the side of the throat, and then two pelagics to the left with their very tiny bills, smaller birds. You can see very nicely how the pelagic has a lot longer tail than the Brandt's just to the right of it. All three in the water together, not that easy to pick out, but mostly double-crested with their bright bills. On the far left of the picture, there's a Brandt's between two double-crested, and then there's several pelagics in the upper right of the picture. But they very, very often are together. They feed together and roost together, so you really can find a lot of places to compare the three. They all breed in Washington.
Is there any crossbreeding?
No hybridization, to my knowledge, has ever been reported in any cormorants. They're all very social all year long. They're social in the non-breeding season. They get out, they feed together in some areas, they perch together when they're not feeding, and they nest in colonies, the vast majority of them. These are just double-crested cormorants on an island in Dungeness Bay. You may notice the harbor seals that they're roosting with there. And they can gather in very, very large numbers, as on these docks at Semiahmoo Spit, near Blaine, where they sometimes roost with harbor seals as well. Guanay in Peru, I mentioned that they nest in very large numbers, sometimes thousands of them on the tops of islands on the coast of Peru. Cape cormorants in Namibia roosting on a pier. May well be 1,000 of them on that pier. They just cover it completely, and flocks of them flying by constantly, not nesting there, just roosting. But they do come out of the water, unlike a loon or a grebe, which stays in the water all of the time. Cormorants come out of the water regularly after they're foraging, and I'll tell more about that. Neotropic cormorants, and several species perch in trees very commonly. Our double-crested does that. Neotropic does that. A couple of others in the old world. Just because they're social and friendly and all like that doesn't mean on an individual basis they don't get into tiffs. There's a lot of, when they come to a roosting area, there's a lot of shuffling, and there's a lot of poking and get away from me. And you see that a lot when there's a lot of birds coming into a roost. They'll sometimes fly in and there's no place for them to land. They'll circle around a little bit and nobody is edging aside to give them space. So then they just have to, sometimes they get tired of flying, just drop into the water. Other times they actually fly off and look for another roosting place, because sometimes the roosting place is full. They fly in lines when they're going places, very much like geese, sometimes in V's when there are lots of them. Double-crested is flying high overhead in Washington. The other two species don't fly that high. They tend to stay down near the water. Pelagic shown here in Brandt look very similar when they're flying along the water. They land with their feet. When they're coming into land, they extend those big feet out. Here's a Brandt's cormorant coming into land off the Edmonds Pier. They just skid in like an airplane skidding on its floats. And that slows them down as they're coming to land. A neotropic cormorant coming to land, again, puts its feet out in front, spreads its tail out, which sort of reduces its flight speed. And they take off with their feet. Those feet are pretty important. When they start to fly, they slap the water with both feet simultaneously. If you've ever watched loons taking off or ducks, they paddle along the surface with their feet making alternate strokes, just like we might do. We were trying to take off. Cormorants and pelicans and boobies and hingas all do this both feet simultaneously when they take off. Splash the water. They get moving faster and faster, and then they finally get into the air. Or not. There's a species that's flightless, the cormorant endemic to the Galapagos Islands, the flightless cormorant, has much reduced wings. Apparently, it doesn't really need to go anywhere. It can find all the fish it needs right off the little islands they nest on there, and they've evolved flightlessness. So something that happens on island birds, but not very often on seabirds. foot propelled divers, as I said, with toady palmate feet. You can see all four toes connected. The hind toe is rather long, just to facilitate this very, very large web they have. This is a pelican foot. I didn't have one. I didn't have a cormorant foot at the Puget Sound Museum to photograph. What was I going to say about these? Oh yeah, Brandt's cormorant in Washington diving. So here's shows the sequence, what happens when they dive. They push themselves forward with their feet. They point their bill, their head into the water, go up in the air, splash, disappear. Double-crested cormorant doing the same thing. Pushing itself with its, this one didn't jump as high as the Brandts did, pushes itself down with its feet. Tail coming after it. Those great big feet are pushing it down now. Sticking out to the side. And down. Different birds swimming and diving underwater. You can see those very large webbed feet. You can see why those feet are so important, and they're all the toes are webbed, gives them even more pushing power. They're amazing underwater. You think, well, how could a bird swimming underwater catch a fish? A fish is in its own element. We know how fast they can swim. By golly, cormorants catch them, as do loons and grebes and mergansers. Here's I didn't take this picture. This is this is the only picture in here from the web. Just shows a cormorant, perfectly natural habitat underwater, and they can. There are videos online that you can just ask YouTube for cormorant swimming underwater, and it will show you cormorants pursuing fish underwater, and you just be amazed how fast they can go. They have wettable flight feathers. Most birds have oil all over their plumage to keep them warm and dry, even when they're in this colder water or cold air for that matter. Cormorant flight feathers have reduced, it's got nothing to do with the oil, it's just got to do with the structure of the feathers, so that the feathers aren't as buoyant, so that when they're staying underwater for long periods chasing fish, they don't have a tendency to rise to the surface. Because if you ever watch something like a duck stop paddling, it immediately pops up to the surface. A cormorant doesn't do that. It actually has to swim back up to the surface. And so they get very wet. And so they dry their feathers by airing them like this, like we see double-crested cormorants doing all the time. Interestingly, some cormorants do it all the time, some relatively rarely. Brandts and Pelagic do it much less often, but you do see them with their wings outstretched as well. So some places you may read that they don't have preen glands, and that's why their feathers are wettable. That's not true. Perfectly good preen glands, and their body feathers, they preen, and they're well oiled and well insulated. Here's a little black cormorant doing this. Most of the cormorants I've seen with their wings out at one time or another, after they forage, they get out of the water, try to dry off, and then before they go forage again. And that's probably why they have big wings and long tails, so they're much more flyers than things like ducks and grebes are. Here's a double-crested cormorant with water droplets on its back, just like you could see water off a duck's back. You've heard that. Same thing happens with a cormorant when it comes up. They've got a hooked bill and an expansible throat, and it's quite amazing. If you watch cormorants at roosts for long enough, you get to see things like this. I think they're just stretching everything to sort of make sure it's working well, like we stretch sometimes. And the throat is very expansible, as you'll see later on. Here's a red-faced cormorant opening its mouth. It's really, you can see a pretty big fish ought to be able to go down that gullet. And there you go, a double-crested cormorant with a big sculpin. I've watched these. The pier at Edmonds is a great place to watch cormorants foraging, and I watched them catching all kinds of different things there. This is a huge buffalo sculpin here, and they actually swallow fish that size. And you can see the bill stuck into the head of this. This is a different bird, different sculpin. They just pierce these fish with their hooked bill so they can hold on to them. And very often they will hold them for a while, sometimes holding them above the water, manipulating them. And that's so the fish basically drowns or asphyxiates in the air. It's the opposite of drowning, but it's still asphyxiating. They're not in the water, they can't breathe. Much better that the fish dies before the bird swallows it, because these fish have big spines on their gills and sometimes spines on their pectoral fins. And there's many a bird has been seen in the wild with a fish spine sticking through its throat. So they tend to play with them for a while, I presume, so the fish will die in the air. And then they can swallow these absolutely immense fish, and their throat looks like that for a while. That must be a meal that'll last, I don't know how long, but I would say for a while, maybe till the next day. Here's one in fresh water in Lake Washington catching a brown bullhead. Again, the same thing happens in fresh water. Sometimes the fish they catch are a little bit problematic. This is a penpoint gunnel, very common fish in saltwater. All the cormorants go down. Those cormorants that go to the bottom, in fact, those fish-eating birds, I would say, that go to the bottom in Puget Sound eat an awful lot of gunnels. They seem to be very abundant and relatively easy to catch, but they do pose a problem when you get them up in the air. But I watched this cormorant for a while, and it did keep manipulating that little fish and everything, and finally, maybe it died, maybe it just stopped being so active and it was able to swallow it. Pelagic cormorant with a prickleback, another kind of eel-like fish related to the gunnels. Again, they catch a lot of these and they manipulate them and then swallow them. Here's another pelagic with a shiner perch, a very abundant schooling fish in Puget Sound. They catch a lot of those as well. So they catch fish of all different shapes and sizes. Just, I guess, the biggest is the biggest they can swallow. They take a lot of, I've never seen a double-crested cormorant come up with a shrimp, but pelagics eat a lot of shrimp. So they're a much smaller bird, and shrimp obviously is a perfectly good meal for them. Brandts, as I say, have a different feeding style than double-crested and pelagic. They're mid-water feeders. They swim along in very deep water and sometimes in flocks, and they go after fish like herrings and sand lances and things like that, that are fish that are in big schools, what they call bait fish in the fishing world. This is a sand lance, one of the very common schooling fish in Puget Sound. Neotropic cormorants here are doing what many others do, getting in big flocks and going after schooling fish or fish that are common in the environment. This is in fresh water, big lake, and these birds came in by the large numbers that you can see are flying to this, joining one another basically. And I think what they do is they actually herd the fish underwater. They dive and are pushing these schools of fish around, just like you see in nature programs of marlin doing this and whales doing it and sea lions doing it. And then they come to the surface, and some of them fly, some of them have fish, as you can see here, and they dive again and keep doing it again. Mergansers will sometimes do the same thing. Again, even though these are social and they seem to be working together, it's not all love and kindness, that's for sure. They will kleptoparasitize prey from one another. I've seen it numerous times in double-crested cormorants. One comes up with a fish. If there's another one nearby, every chance that it will try to get the fish from its neighbor. And in this particular case, this second bird chased the first one and actually made it drop, caused it to drop the fish, or the first bird just got tired of being chased and dropped it anyway, and the second bird got it. And after all that eating, of course, they're metabolic animals, and they've got to do this. And you saw those sculpins and those gunnels and everything. This is what they get reduced to going through that long digestive tract. Pretty amazing. As breeding season comes around, they start developing this distinctive breeding plumage, which in the case of double-crested cormorants means putting on a pair of crests on the head. You might call them plumes. Usually the skin gets a little brighter. This is the time they develop the blue on their throat. And their plumes their crests can be either black or white. In this area, they're black in most areas, but from here north into Alaska, we have both black and white crested types. And then they start their nesting. They go up into trees or wherever they are and start doing courtship behavior. This is one courting another one. They make whatever noises you hear cormorants make. You sometimes hear, they're usually not particularly noisy birds at all, but they have grunts and sounds that they make. You really have to be pretty close to them to hear them saying anything. They start bringing in nesting material to their colonies, almost entirely colonial, but there are a few species that nest in very small colonies. Double-crested cormorants at the Potholes Reservoir in eastern Washington, all over their range. They nest in trees. the only one that of our cormorants that nests in trees and that actually inhabits fresh water. Or they can nest on things like channel markers and docks and the like. This photograph was taken yesterday in Grays Harbor. We were doing the shorebird stuff at Grays Harbor yesterday, and I hadn't realized that any double-crested cormorants in Washington were actually in range of a camera from the shore. I thought that all the colonies were out on islands and places like that, but these birds are actually, unfortunately, we couldn't cross the runway. This is at the Hoquiam Airport. And so we had to watch them and photograph them all the way across a big wide runway, but it was really neat seeing a place where they were on nests. They nest in trees very commonly. This is in Malheur Refuge in Oregon. This is in the Everglades National Park in Florida. A very, very wide-ranging and very successful species. Parenthetically, I should say that this bird is the enemy of fisher people, fishermen and fisherwomen, and as such, it is controlled by the Fish and Wildlife Service, by state game departments, by Indian tribes, and at least 1 million double-crested cormorants have been killed purposely in North America because they compete with us for fish, and they're still abundant. So that's something about nature. To me, that's a sad thing that we kill all these animals just because they compete with us, but that's what we do. They nest on islands. This is one of the small islands in the San Juans. You can, if you have a boat, you can pull your boat right up there and watch them to heart's content. Nesting with glaucous winged gulls. This is another island. Oh, this is at Lake Lenoir in eastern Washington. They nest on islands in Lenoir Lake in eastern Washington. These are a couple of adults with the orange throats. Most of them are juveniles, fully grown juveniles with the yellow throats. When they grow up, they're very fuzzy. The adults have to leave them for long times in the nest to go out and find fish. And so the downy young in the nest aren't brooded much of the time. And so they actually develop a very dense coat of down that keeps them warm when their parents are away. And they look about like the adults then. There's another adult again in Florida Everglades and Anhinga Trail with a juvenile to the right, fully grown young. Brandt's cormorant develops fantastic plumes when in breeding color. You can see this on the dock at Edmonds and other places in Puget Sound starting in late February and on into the spring. And then they leave and go to their nesting islands on the outer coast. They develop brilliant blue throats at that time. They go to their nesting islands, start gathering nesting material. The nesting material can be land plants of all kinds. It can be marine algae that have floated into the shore or even floating on the water surface. They just start displaying then. That's where you see where this blue throat comes in handy. That's when you hear cormorants doing most of their vocalizations, is when they're actually displaying to get a mate in the spring. Pretty impressive. They nest on islands, usually on the tops of islands, in rocky areas, much like the guanais do in Peru and the Cape cormorants do in Africa and several other species do. Big colonies. Pelagic, our third species, develops white flank patches very early in the season. Starting in February, you start seeing these cormorants with these white flank patches. That's their breeding plumage. They actually hold it for several months. Our only cormorant that does something like that. They also develop a double crest, but it's fore and aft rather than on either side. Just by accident, this could easily have been called a double-crested cormorant. And they get the facial skin sort of intensifies to a fairly bright, not bright red, but red-orange anyway. And they start gathering nesting material. These are birds on a jetty in Oregon getting nesting material. Stuff, I guess, actually land plants that are growing out there. And then carrying them to their colony nearby, which can be on a cliff, which is where they obviously originally nested, on cliff ledges all over the place. But those have been replaced in many areas by human-built structures, anthropogenic structures that many birds nest on. They take the place of the cliffs. And the birds incubate their eggs for probably close to a month. They're pretty large eggs. They lay 2 or 3 eggs usually, all the species, incubate them for quite long periods. It takes a while for that embryo to develop. There's some young, the eggs have hatched in this particular nest. You can see these naked, black, rubbery looking young in the bottom of the nest. A little bit better view there. Probably, they come close to being the ugliest animals that natural selection has ever produced, baby cormorants. What do they say? Only a mother could love them. You have to say only a mother or father could love them, because both sexes, of course, spend equal time in parental care, incubating the eggs, feeding the young. Here's those pelagic cormorant chicks at a much larger age when they've fledged and they've actually left the nest, and they're sort of gathering at the edge of a nesting colony. This is on the pier with the ferry landing at Anacortes, which is a wonderful place to watch pelagic cormorants nest. Very downy, as I said. The adults leave them at this time because they can keep warm on their own. They're already learning how to fight with one another. Great cormorants in Nova Scotia on cliff ledges, pretty much like some of the others do, developing chicks in there. Cape cormorant in South Africa, also nesting in such a place. An awful lot of them use cliff ledges, rocky islands. Imperial shag in the Falkland Islands, one of the black and white ones with a blue eye ring. There were a lot fewer cormorants at one point, especially in the southern hemisphere, but people realized that cormorants of different island groups had different DNA and had different morphological features and color features. So there's a big bunch of splitting into a whole bunch of different southern hemisphere cormorants. Antarctic shag in Antarctica, all the nests look pretty similar, the nests that are on Rocky Island, but they all have plant material. They all bring plants, either terrestrial plants from around them or algae and things like that they get from the sea. And some of them even put rocks like penguins do in their nests. Red-faced cormorants in Alaska, well along in their nesting season, the same sort of nesting place. Long-tailed cormorants in Ghana. We went to Ghana just in March. So these photos are fresh out of the camera, and they're fascinating because this is at a pond right in the capital of Ghana, Accra. These things have big fleshy wattles on the side of their bill. I'd never seen anything like that. There's 3 young, and they have white heads with totally weird looking young. And when the adult comes to the nest, these red markings, the red wattles obviously make the young very obvious and very, very clear to the adult when it's feeding. This is an unusual one in which this is an immature long-tailed cormorant. Obviously, they nest when they're not fully mature, which is something I'd never seen in cormorants before. And those young are hungry, and they stretch their neck, and they're calling, they're squawking at the time like baby birds so often do. And that's how they get fed. The adult brings a fish or part of a fish partially digested up into its throat. And many, many seabirds do this. And the young, to get that fish, just sticks his head right down the throat of the adult. So aren't you glad you're not a cormorant? And that's it.
Thank you, Dennis. Questions? Who's got a question there? We'll try to run around and get a mic to everybody. We'll start.
That geo or something was the Chinese with the ropes around the necks. Is that something that's got away?
No, I have never seen that. And I guess I could have taken another picture off the internet and shown that. The Chinese in the Pacific coast of China use cormorants to catch fish for them. And they're still doing that. They've done it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Somebody will go out in a boat with a number of relatively tame. These are great cormorants, and they have rings around their neck, and they're tied to a rope or a line of some kind, and they let them go. And the cormorant will go out and catch a fish, and then they will reel it in, basically. And of course, they feed them. They give them some of them. The cormorants get some reward, but the people who are doing this, the cormorant fishermen, get these fish. They usually go to places where they know there are a lot of fish. It's a very well developed thing. And I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, it really been impressive because that was the first time I'd seen men working with wild creatures, and And it was a long time, it must have been an Nat Geo or something.
Yeah, it's been in various nature films, I think, too, you know.
Dear folks sitting here, we have 79 people, various spots who would like to hear what you are saying too. So would you please
So-
be able to use the microphone?
Oh, so wait for the microphone. I could hear him well, but maybe somebody in Walla Walla couldn't.
John handed me the microphone. Like, so I'm wondering about eye color. And of course, we could ask this about lots of species or families, et cetera, but any theories on like reasons for the diversity of eye color among cormorants?
Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't explain it other than that it could be used for species recognition, which it is in some cases. It's probably used for just to make them fancier looking, because I don't think a green eye sees fish underwater better than a blue eye or a brown eye. So that's one of the really interesting things about nature is these kinds of uses of color, or sometimes we don't quite know why, but aren't happy they do. And other questions?
Yeah. Dennis, are cormorants a prey species for marine animals?
Not so much that I know of. I wouldn't doubt it if the occasional big sea lion takes one underwater, and I'm sure eagles occasionally take them. But I haven't read anything about really a major enemy. Like I don't think humpback whales go after schools of cormorants, although you know humpback whales do their bubble feeding when they're put a big ring of bubbles around a school of fish to bring it together. And sometimes little elses like castles, auklets, and murres go into those places to get those fish and are swallowed up by that big whale. But maybe not that often. And I have never heard of cormorants getting so taken. And I don't know of any other than North Americans who kill them because they eat the fish. I don't know anywhere in the world where cormorants are eaten. I don't think they taste very good or disturbed by people in any particular way.
Dennis, are cormorants related to darters and anhingas?
Yes, closely related.
Closely related. That's from an away team person. Here's another one.
Questions coming from around.
Yes, I was told by the fisherman, this is a very nice Chinese lady. I was told by the fisherman that these cormorants can never be domesticated. They have to let them go.
That I don't know, but I believe it. You know, after they've done their service for a while, I think it's good they let them go.
How about, yeah. Your good friend. Wait, there we go. Sorry. People fishing with cormorants are shown in a classic children's book, The Story About. Wow, good for you. Good for you. Any thoughts regarding the reason for the relatively large number of Brandt cormorant in Wahkiakum County this spring?
Oh, they've gone up to Wahkiakum. They've gone up.
Wahkiakum,
A
oh
number of
God.
Brandt cormorants have been seen in Wahkiakum County, which is well up the Columbia River by birders. And they're just thinking, well, why are they coming up there? I don't know. You know, maybe they have discovered some sort of run up there where young salmon or young something are common. And they just sort of slowly moving up the Columbia River, following them. No, it's not a large number of them.
You talked about other species that cormorants are close to. Are they related at all to pelicans?
Well, actually, we thought they're toady palmate, which pelicans are, and we thought they were in the same order of birds for a very, very long time. Maybe between 5 and 10 years ago, again, using DNA, which is what we're doing more and more to show relationships, they realized that pelicans were their own order and actually more closely related to herons and storks and ibises than they are to cormorants. So there's a convergent evolution, I guess, of these toady palmate feet, and they all take off with 2 feet at a time and so forth.
And the mouths.
And big mouths. Yeah.
You got their juices flowing now. I was hearing that cormorant wings stretch. What? I was hearing that cormorant wings stretching was also for thermoregulation.
They
Can you
can't,
go?
I guess if they're and hingas do this, if they're sitting in a sunny area, they can warm up by exposing their wings to the sun too.
Does someone have, here's another. Do cormorants that live in saltwater have a salt gland like gulls and other pelagic species?
I don't, no, they don't have a groove, they don't have grooves in their skull for such glands, like are very prominent in gulls and loons and some other groups, but they probably have some sort of salt gland for the same reasons.
Regarding,
To get rid of the salt in the water that they drink all the time.
regarding the size of fish that cormorants eat, a video recently was sent around among fishery biologists showing cormorants wolfing down adult pink salmon, not as large as Chinook, coho, or sockeye, but even so, huge fish.
I can't imagine a cormorant getting a whole adult
We're
pink
gonna have to-
salmon.
we're gonna have to look for that video.
Yeah, maybe younger or smaller adult pink salmon. I mean, I just watched spawning pink salmon this last fall, and they're that big, they're that big around, so
Places in Alaska, they're really a lot smaller.
smaller. Oh, that's it then. Yeah.
Back to salt. Do cormorants drink salt water?
Sure,
Okay,
that's all they have to drink. Yeah,
well, okay. And where
The
does the
one-
red-faced cormorant live in Alaska?
in the Aleutian Islands and the Kuril Islands and in Asia, basically, and St. Paul and the Pribilofs. Just all way, but interestingly, they actually nest with pelagic cormorants in the Aleutian Islands. It's two very similar species nesting near one another in colonies, which is relatively unusual in cormorants.
Elizabeth says, Wildlife Center of the North Coast has a beloved resident double-crested cormorant. I don't know where the center of the North Coast is.
Yeah, I don't know either.
She wanted us to know that.
Oh, good, thanks.
Anyone else out here?
I read somewhere that cormorants are some of the deepest diving birds, that they can dive like 120 feet or something.
Say that again. I think, yeah,
They're
heard-
some of the deepest diving birds that they can dive 120 feet. It's been a while, but
Yeah, no,
that seems very,
They dive very deeply, as do some other diving birds, like Cassin's auklets, I think, have gone down to 150 feet, little tiny bird that big.
do
But
they,
they dive deeply as well, you know.
do they have some special, I mean, that's a couple of atmospheres of pressure. So I
Yeah.
just wondered if there's some special adaptation in their physiology.
Whales and pinnipeds have
Yeah.
special adaptations. I don't. If birds have them, I don't know. I think they can just be, they do exhale before they go down to reduce their buoyancy. Beyond that, I don't know.
Thank you.
Question.
Thank you. Apparently that wildlife center is in Astoria.
You know, it's
Pretty
interesting
close.
because when we go underwater, we take a big breath very often, whereas real diving animals exhale as much as they can to reduce their buoyancy and then go down.
Oh, here's one. Many seabirds eat and then feed plastics to their young, their offspring. Has pollution affected cormorants?
I don't think as much as it has Alston.
Smarter.
The shearwaters, you know, as far as I know, because we're doing a lot of work with plastics at the Puget Sound Museum and looking in the gullets of many, many, many birds. And they're mostly fulmar shearwaters and murres that have lots of plastic. And albatrosses, of course. Yeah, we haven't dissected many albatrosses, but yeah, sure.
I quote, I wonder which is more efficient, double foot or paddling to get airborne. Could it be affected by the bird's weight and foot size? Maybe.
Well, these are biggish birds. They're certainly average bigger than ducks, but loons,
Show me your.
common loons are bigger yet, and they do this. They do
The top.
alternating feet. So I don't know, there may be something about the structure of the way cormorants swim underwater or something that actually dictates this. They swim, again, I think a lot of these other birds swim with alternate paddles when they're underwater too, whereas cormorants swim simultaneous paddles. So there's some different anatomical thing. Probably have to look at the skeletons even to see some differences that probably dictate that or that are adapted to that.
One more comment about the red-faced cormorant or question. What about when the sea is frozen? Do you know anything about their adaptations? Red-faced cormorants in Alaska? Frozen
No
sea.
different than any other cormorants as far as I know. They're very much.
Go
like-
somewhere else.
They're very much like pelagic cormorants, but you mean, why don't they occur in Washington or
Or,
something?
or what do they do when, I think she was asking, what do they do when the ocean is frozen and the
Oh,
sea
they
is
just- they just
frozen?
go south,
go
just
somewhere
stay-
else.
Yeah, stay south of that, yeah. They migrate, they have their short distance migrants.
God, what a great group. It's so good to see these faces. Any
Yeah.
other questions? Oh, Jean. Go.
It's maybe not as relevant right now, but I saw a lot of interesting cormorant behavior, especially double-crested, when I was in the Everglades. The Anhinga Trail, you can get really close.
Fabulous.
Really
Right up-
see
right-
amazing,
yeah.
amazing stuff. And I saw a double-crested get a fish that was so big. It looked like a big trout, I mean, a big fish. And the fight that went on, I don't know, I stood there for the longest time.
He was in the water with it.
Yeah, and it was quite near the trail. So I just watched him circle and circle, and he took that fish down under, seemed to turn it upside down and was swimming around and around. Was it drowning the fish?
Uh,
I mean, I don't think he could hold it up.
Yeah, well, that could be, maybe puncturing it caused it to bleed.
Ah.
It somehow made it weaker and weaker.
But then he would come up for a while and then that
Probably
fish was,
able to breathe.
it wasn't giving up
How
easily.
big was the fish?
Oh, it was long. It was a big, long
Probably a
fish.
bowfin, a very primitive scaly
Mhm.
fish that's pretty common in the Everglades.
Then there was another one that was standing on a shore, and he had somehow pulled a reed into his mouth first and then the fish.
Huh.
And he couldn't figure out what to do.
Oh, wow.
Would he drop the fish so that he could get the reed
I
out?
think they would. You're
He didn't for, I don't know, we watched this thing for half an hour. He was like,
in the,
am
sitting
I
in the
gonna
water,
do?
sitting in the
no,
water,
he's standing on the edge.
but had the fish in its mouth. And
The
the
reed
reed.
was first this way
Yeah.
and the fish.
Cattail, I assume. something
Yeah,
like that.
but it was in there first. And I mean,
One thing you
stuck.
find, one thing you find out when you study nature is that not all, just like all humans aren't the same, not all wolves or bears or birds or snakes or anything are the same. There's a lot of individuality and behavior, which makes it much more interesting to study. And that one maybe was a dumb one or something. Yeah, because that's part, they really are loath to give up this fish. They really try hard to hold on to them. We knew that.
I've got one more here, and it's do cormorants have predators such as bald eagles or such? Like the great blue herons do.
Sorry, I discovered tonight that my hearing aid batteries ran out, so that's why I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Do cormorants have predators such as bald eagles? Like the great blue herons nesting do?
Not as much as great blue herons for some reason. I think maybe the cormorants are in situations where they can very easily get into the water. But I think, yeah, I'm sure bald eagles depredate their nests because they depredate murre colonies on the coast. And I don't know of any such, but I wouldn't be in any way surprised if bald eagles went after them. You know?
Dennis, I was wondering about our local double-crested cormorants and the herons nesting down at the locks. I've seen the herons all situated on their nests, and then the cormorants will circle around in the evening, and then they'll also land in the trees. But it doesn't seem like they're nesting there.
They're only roosting there. I actually checked up on that this spring because I was hoping they were nesting there to actually go get some photos for this lecture. And no, they're not nesting there. They're just roosting.
It's interesting that they share a common roosting area
In-
with other birds.
In the Potholes Reservoir and in the Okanagan River and several other places, they nest together in mixed colonies very commonly.
So do you know where the double-cresteds are nesting around here? Something like off,
I don't know.
a mystery.
On the San Juan Islands and on that thing that I showed you from Bowerman Basin, or from Grays Harbor, actually, those are the only two places I know near here where they're nesting. There may well be others. Oh, they roost there like crazy, but they're not nesting there. Yeah, no, I've spent a lot of time looking for them all up and down that coast there. Even though they're so common, they're not nesting there.
One of those things about the herons and the cormorants at the locks is because all the little fish right down there, right?
Oh, yeah.
Dennis, one of my interns many decades ago was traveling in one of the stands in Central Asia. And she reported that the only thing they had to eat was cormorant. And she said it tasted terrible.
Yeah, any bird that eats entirely fish, you don't really want to eat that bird. Interesting. Yeah, because if they tasted good, I suppose we'd have a hunting season on cormorants in this country.
Any more questions here in the room or in the Zoom? No. If not, well, let's give Dennis a big hand.